Energy Media readers, if you have been following me regularly, and hopefully you've read my book, you will know that I have put a fair amount of time in reporting on the Alberta oil sands greenhouse gas emissions. And the Pembina Institute has just released a new study that has some very interesting implications for the national climate policy and for Alberta. So I'd like to welcome Chris Severson Baker to the interview.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Now, Chris, what we're going to do is we're going to take 5 or 6 minutes and talk about the 3 top issues. And then readers who want to stick around for maybe another 20, 25, maybe who knows how long we'll go, for a more fulsome discussion of some of these issues. So let's get started with the first question. And one of the top, probably the top issue is that regardless of the fact that the companies cut per barrel emission intensity, overall emissions keep rising. What do we do about that?
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, I think we're in a time when climate change is receiving more attention than it ever has. There's a high level of concern. Canada and other countries have responded with pretty significant emission reduction targets that are in line with what the science is calling for. All sectors of the economy are going to need to significantly reduce emissions in order to meet those future targets. And yet we've got the oil sands sector continues to grow in terms of overall emissions, even though a lot of advances have been made on a per barrel basis. Just the amount of growth in the oil sands is driving up overall emissions. And there's going to be a collision with Canada's ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and growth in the oil sands.
As I mentioned to you before we came on, I wrote a column the day after the federal election that said basically all roads to national climate policy run through Alberta. And I think the study illustrates that very well. Well, let's get on to the second question. And that is, companies are committed to, some of these oil sands producers have already committed publicly to net zero emissions by 2050, but and I should point out that the two so far are Synovus Energy and Meg Energy, but that's not necessarily going to lead to deep reduction in oil sands emissions, is it?
No, I think this should be interpreted as a really positive signal on their part, that they recognize that climate change is real, that we need to take action on climate change, and they recognize that Canada has made commitments to fully decarbonize by 2050. And really what they're signaling is a certain degree of willingness to accept the kinds of policies and regulations that would be necessary to get there. But they haven't put in place a pathway or set of commitments that would actually achieve that. And we know that voluntary action just isn't going to get us the kind of deep emission reductions that we really need to see from this sector if we're going to meet Canada's overall commitments.
See, I'm very interested in that because 3 or 4 weeks ago, I wrote a column about Synovus's announcement that it will, its aspirational goal to be net zero by 2050. And I asked the question, okay, look, here's a company that has developed technology, SAGD, solvent substitution. It's generating tons of cash flow, free cash flow. And on top of that, if it's committed to this, why not do it quicker, faster? Well,
they really are looking. They really need the Canadian government and the Alberta government to make this a mandatory requirement for them in order for them to be competitive with other companies. In order for them to, I mean, they think that they would be competitive in this kind of an environment where there's more stringent requirements around carbon emissions, where there's a higher and higher carbon price. And there's a bigger challenge in terms of turning R&D spends into actual innovation that can be commercialized. So they think they're going to be competitive in this new environment, but they're not going to do it voluntarily. They're basically asking for the government to follow through and put in place a policy framework and a set of regulations that create a level playing field that would allow them to do what they need to do.
Well, shades of 2014 and 2015, because this is exactly the issue that was on the table when 5 oil sands CEOs met with 5 ENGO environmental group executive directors, including Pembina, I might add, his name escapes me, but it'll come back. You're
Ed Winningham,
director. Yeah. Yes, thank you, Ed Winningham. And this, there was an agreement, and then it was enshrined in the climate leadership plan. It's almost like we're going back and revisiting issues that have been around that were settled 5 years ago.
I think that's really a good point, that, you know, some of the reasons why the 100 million ton limit was put in place, and some of the other policies, was a direct response to the same kind of concerns that are starting to grow again in relation to the oil sands. And the same reasons why companies were willing to support a pretty ambitious climate policy still exists today. So those, I mean, I was in the room when those discussions were happening between companies and the Premier's office and other environmental organizations, and the companies were quite open about it. They're like, you know, we need government to put in place a framework. We need it to be fair and create a level playing field, but something that drives us in the direction that we know we need to go in if we're going to continue to be supplying oil for transportation and other purposes as the world begins to more significantly decarbonize. They recognize that's the challenge that their industry faces, and they actually need the government to push them in that direction.
I'm going to wrap this up, the second question up, with this comment, because I've been asked by readers many times, if this is good for business, and I mean decarbonization, why don't the companies just do it voluntarily? And the point, and I've asked the executives in interviews why that is, and they're very clear about it. You can't be the first one out of the gate on this stuff. It's either everybody does it or nobody does it.
Yep.
And the industry feels that way, and so that's just the way it is. I mean, that's why they need this kind of level playing field, as you say. So let's get on to the third question, which is, you've suggested in the study that we need new regulations and a higher carbon tax. What regulations and what level of carbon tax?
Well, there's a lot of different ways that you could approach this. I mean, I think the thing that is most obvious would be to fully implement the emission limit with regulations, and then have it decline over time in some kind of stepwise fashion in alignment with Canada's commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from this sector and all other sectors. As well, at the same time, a carbon price that rises incrementally and on a planned and predictable way, so that we actually get the kind of price signal that is required for companies to implement some of the innovations that they've already developed, that are, including the ones that have been commercially proven, and actually get them into operation, as well as to drive the kind of R&D that's necessary to go looking for some of those sort of more breakthrough types of innovations that are going to be necessary for some of the operations to remain viable down the line.
Well, Chris, we've come to the end of the 6 minutes that I promised we would stick to. So readers who feel that you can actually, on the Energy Media website, you can go and read the press release, and the publication, the study itself, is available from pembina.org. So if readers want more detail, that's where they can get it. But now you and I are going to get into the weeds a little bit on this. And I interviewed Harbir China, who is the VP of Technology at Synovus, for my book. And in fact, I've interviewed him a number of times. And he said, this is 2017, at that time he said, we like a carbon tax, but we need the longest runway possible to innovate. Start early, raise the carbon price gradually, and we can adapt and innovate our way around it to meet targets. We're fine with that. And that's one of the reasons why I was very critical of the Kenney government when they replaced the carbon competitive incentive regulation with CCIR with the tier, which now, instead of having a benchmark, industry benchmark that they're measured against, they're now measured against their own facility, as they were under the old ESCR, under the PC government's days. And that, I think Andrew Leach, the economist from the U of A, estimated that diluted the impact of the program by about a third for the oil sands. So we actually went backwards, and even if we raise the carbon tax, it's still not going to have the kind of impact that it would have had under CCIR. Your thoughts, please.
Well, I think, yeah, we've heard very clearly from companies that they support carbon price, and the same notions: start early, gradual, predictable, something that we can factor into our plans, and it also needs to be fair, applied equitably across the board. And I think we took that formed the basis of the climate change leadership policy announcement, and then I think it was there was a very good consultation process that was overseen by Andrew Leach that resulted in the system that was ultimately developed. And so it is disheartening to sort of take out some of the sort of more sophisticated elements of that carbon pricing scheme for no obvious benefit to industry as a whole or to the province or climate change overall. And I think that I think that really what we're talking about here is that we used to have a system that wasn't tilted in the favor of the more progressive companies or the companies that had a bit of an advantage. It was sort of meant to sort of benefit everybody, and we really lost something when we went back to the old approach.
Well, let's illustrate how that works. So let's say that you're Synovus and you're using natural gas to create steam to make the bitumen down in your reservoirs viscous enough that you can get it into your pipes and pump it up into your wellbore and pump it up to the surface. Now, the Synovus steam oil ratio, as it's referred to, is around 1.8 or 2, which is very, very low. I mean, that's about as low as it gets within the industry. But there are companies like Husky in its combined cycle steam up in the Lloydminster area, Cold Lake area, that have an SOR of 8. So under the CCIR, where Husky, for instance, had to hit industry benchmarks that would be set by companies like Synovus, that was a huge penalty. Husky complained bitterly when CCIR came in. Synovus, on the other hand, because it's already reasonably efficient in this area, would have received credits. They would have actually had money. They could have sold those credits then to Husky and generated revenue for themselves. So they were incented to lower their SOR to gain more credits for themselves, and Husky would be incentivized to reduce its SOR in order to not have to buy as many credits, so the cost would be lower. That was a system that seemed to work really well. Now Husky only has to reduce that SOR by like 1% a year.
Right.
Which really,
so it's, from an economic efficiency standpoint, you want the companies that can reduce the most greenhouse gas emissions at the lowest cost to go as far as they possibly can. And that system created an incentive for them to do that because they would get paid. And then you also have a system that's fair. Companies can pay rather than actually reduce if the cost of actually reducing their emissions exceeds the cost of paying. And so you end up with an economically efficient model. It certainly benefits companies that have a better steam to oil ratio or have made investments in technologies that drive their emissions down or just simply operate their facilities differently. And over the longer term, you can imagine a scenario where the companies that are being paid because they've been able to reduce emissions are able to be more successful, maybe even expand production, whereas other companies who are not actually may be forced to cease production at some point when the carbon price reaches a certain level. But that is a level playing field, and the rules apply equitably to everybody.
Right. I want to bring up the work of Kevin Byrne, who's the chief economist in Calgary for IHS Markit, and who has done some of the best work around identifying the GHG intensity of the various facilities in the oil sands. Now, one of the points he makes in his study that came out last year is the high variability between facilities. So you might have, some of those facilities have 40 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel. They're very efficient. They're, leading that sector. And then you might have some of the older legacy plants like Syncrude that are 127. they're more than 3 times the new stuff. And yet the legacy plants, what do you say to Suncor or Syncrude that have invested, literally billions in these plants and want to get the maximum economic benefit out of it during the life of the plant? Yet they're the most inefficient and most polluting in a way. I don't know. Do you have any ideas on how we should handle it?
That's a tough one. I mean, I think we're trying to highlight the big challenge with our paper and just sort of to name that issue, because we try to get across the point in the paper. It's one of the things that's not well understood is that there isn't an average barrel of oil, with an average CO2 per barrel. We're really talking about very different streams. Like each stream has its own path that it will follow in a decarbonization pathway. Some of those pathways, you can imagine them going all the way down to 2040, 2050 and being competitive both in terms of price and CO2, whereas others, you can sort of imagine them hitting some kind of a brick wall unless there is some kind of breakthrough technology that will enable them to continue on that path. So some of these, I think it's just a reality that, some resources and some companies are positioned to do better under this kind of new reality than others. And those companies that have a high CO2 per barrel are going to have to make some tough choices about where they want to place their investments. Can they see an opportunity through the purchase of offsets and maybe capturing some of their emissions to stay in business for a certain period of time, even if they can't necessarily imagine how they're going to remain competitive unless some kind of breakthrough comes along later.
Right. I want to introduce an idea here, Chris, that I've been exploring for the last 6 or 12 months, and especially after I was out doing signings and so on around my book and talking to Albertans and people in the industry. And that is, so when you write your study and you identify a problem, so oh my goodness, we've got an issue, we got a problem, and quite right that you should do that. But the other thing that we don't talk about is hope and optimism, which is the antidote to fear and concern and negative. And here's why I bring this up. All of the oil sands companies that I interviewed agreed that part of the benefit of decarbonizing is not just to avoid the carbon tax. It is to gain a competitive advantage in Asian markets over the next 5 or 10 years. And I guess avoiding the carbon tax is part of their strategy because they expect, like, China's already got the biggest carbon market in the world. It's going to be eventually applied to the downstream sector, and everybody selling oil to Chinese refineries are going to have to pay the carbon tax. If you've decarbonized your heavy crude more than Venezuela or Mexico or Brazil or Colombia, then you have a competitive advantage over those competitors. And so they see it as a positive thing. This is making them more competitive on the global market in a low carbon world. And I don't think we spend nearly enough time. In fact, we spend no time, except for my book, Plug. We spend no time talking about it. Your thoughts, sir?
I think it's true that in the process of meeting the kinds of sectoral limits that are necessary in Canada, in order to sort of meet the expectations of investors and consumers in our current markets around the carbon intensity of production, that's also driving industry in the direction of being competitive potentially in other markets. I think it's a tough one, I think, for everybody to kind of get their heads wrapped around because of the kinds of a sort of accounting system that we would need to have in place at an international level for something like that to be really robust. But I think it's sort of a no regrets approach that we ought to be taking in terms of dealing with our own domestic emissions, while exploring the possibility of Canadian oil and gas supplies displacing less carbon or displacing more carbon intense forms of oil elsewhere in the world, if we can figure out an international methodology that would actually make sure that that's real and not just sort of an environmental attribute that's only on paper.
Well, and fair enough. But this is the environment the oil sands companies themselves anticipate that they're going to be operating in the not too distant future, and they're preparing for it. That's what part of what this is all about. But let's talk about another aspect of this, which is the new focus on ESG, environment, social, and governance. So I interviewed a professor today from Haskayne School of Business, and he was saying that yes, while Canada has and Alberta has in the past performed well on ESG, we're starting to see some real scrutiny by investors such as BlackRock, where they're saying, look, managing your climate risk will depend, how well you do it will depend on the cost of your capital and even whether you can get capital. And so GHG emissions have emerged as a major risk factor in companies getting financing. But now we're seeing other things. I mean, you could argue that the Wet'suwet'en blockade of the Coastal GasLink pipeline is now a social risk or a governance risk. And investors are all about managing risk. And we keep pumping the risk up, which is going to affect access to capital and financial viability for these companies. Now, I know I've rattled on here a little bit, Chris, but I think this is a point that is not well understood in Alberta. It's certainly not within the industry. It probably is, but certainly not at the public level. What do you think?
Well, I think people have anticipated that investors would begin to focus more on these types of things for a long time. And many people including the Pembina Institute, has tried to use that as an argument for being more proactive about dealing with the whole suite of issues. So, including some of the issues associated with the non-climate issues, around reducing cumulative effects on the landscape, managing the use of fresh water, and that sort of thing. The argument was very much, we can do a better job of managing these impacts. We can do a better job of accounting for the overall impact, demonstrating that we're below an environmental threshold in Alberta, demonstrating that there's a plan, that we know what the forecast growth in that impact to that particular media is and how we're going to manage below it, and therefore have reduced the risk that investors see, but also improve the overall social license to operate as a hedge against things that we don't know might be coming in the future. Increased in concern around particular environmental issues that the public or Indigenous communities are focusing on. And so, I think, we paid a lot of lip service to these types of things over the past in Alberta, and but there's still a good argument for being proactive about dealing with these things, because you don't know, they're doable, and you don't know when you're going to really need them in order to satisfy investors and to maintain the access to capital.
Sure, and I agree. And I saw the remarks that Tim McMillan, the CEO of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, made about your study today. Again, downplaying the risk, downplaying the threat. We've got it under control. We're the best in the world. And I think there's a really dangerous perspective here, in that many in the industry have persuaded themselves that they are the best. They are the best practice in the world, and everybody else has to catch up to them. They don't have to worry as much about it, and therefore they poo-poo studies like yours that really should be a red flag. It should be an alarm bell that they should be listening to, and instead they kind of slough it off. And I think that is a dangerous strategy, and it's going to come back to bite the industry in the not too distant future. And I imagine you agree with me.
Certainly do. I mean, I think one of the most important things we can do as a province right now is really to be really realistic about what our position is with respect to our oil and gas holdings, and what the future under carbon constrained world looks like. We can't be if we're going around fooling ourselves and telling ourselves things that are not that are a bit of an exaggeration, but sounds and we believe it, but other people in the world are not buying it. We're not doing ourselves any favors at all. And so I think we have a little bit of an echo chamber happening in Alberta, where we've been telling ourselves and patting ourselves on the back, but the rest of the world is looking at it going, that's not looking so good. That's a concern. And it also plays out in terms of things like, the inquiry in the war room, and some of these tactics that have been adopted by the Alberta government to sort of push back and to try and create a different story about the oil sands, that's not playing well outside of Alberta either. And so I think we just need to get realistic about where we stand, and then, you know, because I think there are things that we can do to better position ourselves in this challenging environment in the future. But if we kind of ignore that, we actually are creating a lot more risk for ourselves in the next 3 or 4 years.
Let me sum up the riskiest issue this way, at least on the finance side. The Haskane professor that I referred to earlier told me about meetings that he's had recently in Toronto with, banks' head offices talking about climate risk and other kinds, well, ESG risk, basically, and access to capital. And he said, I was told point blank, and many of the people who told me were former Albertans, grew up in Alberta and went off to work in banking in Toronto. And he says, I was told that Alberta does not get the ESG challenge and how far behind it is and the consequences it could have for access to capital for the industry. If they don't get their act together on things like climate risk and GHG emissions, they are done. It was a very blunt comment. I was kind of shocked. I agree with that. You agree with that. I bet you there isn't a person in the executive suites of downtown Calgary that agrees with that.
And that's the kind of thing that we really, part of the reason why we wrote this report is we want to try to start more of a conversation about the facts. Like, what can we agree on? What's the reality that we're facing? How are we going to respond to it? Because there is a lot of a focus on the sort of public relations and telling stories that people want to hear, rather than getting right down to the base situation that we find ourselves in. It's a very dangerous place for us as a province to be in if we're not dealing with facts, but we're actually dealing more with emotions and feeling like put upon by others.
Well, look, I mean, you're talking to the guy that tells stories that CAP and the Alberta government really don't want to hear. So I get that all the time. But let's end this interview on a more positive note, Chris, because one of the things that I think is, and it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is I thought the Notley government was not able to connect the dots on their own energy and climate policies. They had a terrible narrative, and I think Jason Kenney exposed that weakness in last April's election campaign. But nevertheless, there is a tremendous story and there's tremendous opportunity. What is required, in my opinion, is a concerted effort. Government and industry associations and the leaders have got together and say, folks, this is an existential crisis we are staring in the face. Not we have to convince Albertans that it is. We can't pretend anymore that it isn't. And we need to act. And if we act now, we can fix the problem. If we don't act, we're in trouble. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, one of the things that I think right off the bat, if we were to start to take meaningful action on this and send the right kind of signals economically to companies, we would see that there's actually a lot in the innovation pipeline that's ready to flow, that will make a big difference in terms of reducing emissions from the oil sands. And then at some point, but we also need to recognize that Alberta is going through, this is going to be a big disruptive transition for the province. And so on the one hand, there's a lot we can do to help the industry to be economically viable in a carbon constrained future and continue to be a significant part of the economy. On the other hand, we need to start looking at what else does Alberta have to offer the world? It's a great place to live, to set up a business. We have a highly trained workforce. We're safe, good education. And we need to start taking stock of all of our assets and promoting all of our assets and anticipating a world that has a different way of meeting sort of the basic needs that people have for energy, transportation, and that sort of thing. And how can we be a part of that?
Chris, thank you very much for this. This has been fascinating, and we only scratched the surface. I think you and I both know that, and I look forward to having you back for many more conversations like this, because this, and I'll say it again, this is an existential threat to Alberta's economy. I can't underscore bold print. We just cannot say this loud enough and more emphatically how serious this problem is and how serious, and how the government and the industry, certain parts of the industry, don't take it seriously. That's a huge concern.
I couldn't agree more, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about our report today, and I do look forward to the next time.
And on that note, thank you very much, Chris. We'll look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you very much.